Alrighty, students, today is Thursday, April 9th. So, we left off talking about depression and anxiety. So, as we know, depression is an overwhelming sadness, a feeling of hopelessness. Some signs and symptoms of that is social isolation, crying, fatigue, restless, lack of sleep, and thoughts of suicide. Anxiety is a nervous and anxious feeling, okay, about a situation or thought. And sometimes you get anxiety over things that you think might happen, like, oh my gosh, what if this happens, that happens, this happens. That's kind of what anxiety is. Hyperventilation, chest tightness, trembling, struggling to concentrate, so they can't really concentrate. So people with test anxiety, that really hurts them, because if they can't concentrate because they have anxiety over the test, it doesn't set them up for success. So that's anxiety. We're going to talk about a couple other mental illnesses. And one category of mental illnesses is addiction. Addiction is very much a mental illness. Okay, it can also be a physical illness, and I'm not just talking about drug addiction, I'm talking about other addictions. So drug addiction is one. There is the physical and psychological. The psychological need for drugs. Why do people do drugs? Because they get some type of high from it, and that is a mental feeling, and then they like that feeling, so they continue to go to it until their body craves it. Then the physical addiction happens. So it starts off as a mental addiction, and it comes into a physical addiction. All right? They might use drugs when they're depressed or bored, so they're self-medicating. This develops unhealthy coping mechanisms. They depend on drugs to change their mood. Another unhealthy coping mechanism. Rather than doing something like exercise or talk to somebody about their problems, they turn to drugs. So that's the mental effect that they're looking for. And then it develops a physical effect after getting hooked on drugs. They use drugs to avoid facing problems, another poor coping mechanism, and deny using drugs to change moods. So if they're denying that they're using drugs and they're using drugs, it's a sign of drug addiction. That one's kind of a common addiction. We'll talk about that more when we get into drugs and alcohol. Let's talk about eating disorders. Eating disorders are a mental illness because it relates to how somebody looks at themselves. So there are cases of people when you look at somebody, if they were anorexic, which means they starve themselves, you ask them how do they look, and they say they will look fat. They actually see themselves as fat. Now, when you look in the mirror, you see your body how it is. When they look in the mirror, they see something completely different. Have you ever been to a carnival and you went into the fun house and you walked into one of those mirrors and it made you really tall and really skinny and it changed the shape of your body? Well, for somebody who's anorexic and has body image, self-image issues, they look into a regular mirror and they see the funhouse version of themselves that's big and bloated, okay? That is why it's a mental illness. Does it have physical effects on the body? Absolutely. They're starving themselves. Their body is thin and frail, but they don't see it that way. They actually see their body as a big blimp or balloon. They don't see their body the same way, and that's kind of how body image. Or they focus on one part of their body and it's not the part of their body that they're comfortable with. This usually happens because they have low self-esteem. They talk to themselves in a terrible way. They feel terrible about themselves, and they desire control over life. Since they can't control the way their body looks, they try to control what they eat to change the way their body looks. Okay? So eating disorders are a very serious category of mental illness. If left untreated, like anorexia, you could die quicker than if somebody were actually obese, okay? So not eating enough is actually more dangerous than eating too much. Along with that, something that can help develop, or not help develop, something that could develop into eating disorder is perfectionism. Perfectionism is another mental disorder. Now, some of you might be perfectionists. Mr. Grando kind of views himself as a little bit of a perfectionist. If it's not perfect, it's not right. But there's the extreme perfectionist that we're talking about here. Compelling need to do everything perfect, okay? They repeat the same task. Like, even if they have it like, if it's supposed to be like 100% level, if it's just a little bit off, just one side just a little bit bigger than the other, they'll keep doing it, even if it's good enough. If they had a 98% A, they will actually start beating themselves up. And some of you are like, man, I'd be happy for a 98% A. Not the perfectionist. The perfectionist wants 100%. And if there was bonus, they expect to get that right too. If it's not 100% or higher, it's not good enough. This can be extremely devastating to mental health. Because if you have to keep repeating the same task, you're not going to ever move on. So you're going to fall behind, and when you fall behind, that develops anxiety and some type of depression, and it's actually going to make them feel worthless because they haven't gotten it perfect. They're overly critical of themselves. When they get like a 98 or a 97, they're going to be like, oh my God, I'm so stupid. And that negative self-talk is going to hurt their self-image and their self-confidence. So perfectionists tend to have self-confidence, self-worth issues. Feel nothing is good enough for them. Nothing will ever be good enough for a perfectionist, no matter what. So this tends to struggle in their relationships with people. Like, they expect more. They expect everybody to be as perfect as they can sometimes. All right, and that really messes with their relationships. How did this develop? Sometimes adults in their lives had unrealistic expectations of them during childhood. So, like, many parents were probably like, you should be able to play the violin at 4. Okay, not many 4-year-olds can play the violin, and I think I'd be amazed to see a 4-year-old who can. I don't even know what it takes to play a violin. Anyway, relationship addiction. Yes. We have these two. Relationships or addiction is a compelling need to be with another person. Believe it or not, this is a mental illness. You feel the need to rely on somebody else or to be with somebody else. That is called a relationship addiction. Now, they use relationships as they would drugs. You're like, I don't get it. Somebody jumps into a relationship to help cope with their depression, anxiety, or other things. It's a terrible coping mechanism. Why? Because if you're just jumping in relationships to fix this problem, you're not fixing the cause of the problem of your depression, anxiety, and other things. And they can be jumping into unhealthy relationships, which will only make these problems worse. But they're not going to leave the relationship because they think they need the relationship to improve their self-worth and self-value. So, they feel the constant need to be with a person or in a relationship. They're described as needy many times, and they cause the person they are with to feel suffocated and drained of energy. Imagine that somebody feels they need to be around you 100% of the time. Imagine that they need you all the time, and when you're not with them for like 2 minutes, they're calling and thinking that you're doing terrible things or cheating on them or something like that. It puts a lot of stress on the other person in the relationship. That causes anxiety and stress on their side too. So it doesn't just affect one person's mental health, it also affects the other person's mental health. The bad part about relationship addicts, and I'm going to get into a little bit of domestic violence here, is if you base your self-worth on your relationship, if you're not in a relationship, do you feel do you feel like you have worth? These people don't. And when they don't feel that they're worth it, they jump into any relationship. So they jump into a relationship with, let's say, an abuser, somebody who abuses them. They get in this relationship and they can't leave because if they leave the relationship, they're not worthwhile. So they're accepting of many of the abuse patterns. And some of the times they'll be like, well, it's my fault that I'm not a better person. When in reality, they're just in a relationship with an abuser. And because they have it could be because of a relationship addiction, it could be because of fear and other things. But because if we're talking about just strictly relationship addiction, because they feel that if they leave, they have no value, and sometimes the abuser will say that you'd be worthless without me, they get stuck in this relationship. So that is something that we need to consider. They have the need to be with another person to complete them / fill them up. They don't feel complete without another person. This is a really dangerous thought. If you feel you need somebody to complete you, that makes you reliant and sets you up for codependence on another person. Okay, and we'll probably get into more relationship addiction later when we talk about relationships. Okay, social media addiction is something like many 7th and 8th graders might have. The compelling need to be on social media. How much time do you spend on social media? If I look at my phone, I'd probably say maybe 15 minutes out of the day spent on social media for me. If you got 1 hour, 2 hours, getting higher than that, you got some serious issues because it takes a couple seconds to go through Twitter. But social media addiction is the compelling need to be on social media. Feels compelling need to post social media and engage in others in social media. So have you ever seen a Facebook post where somebody says something political and then your grandma's always responding or somebody's always responding and it's always that same person that responds? This is a little bit of social media addiction. They feel the need to respond to everybody on social media and all they do is stay on social media. Okay? Now, just because somebody responds doesn't mean they have social media addiction. But if they're always on social media and they're always trying to engage with others, they might have the development of social media addiction. Okay? Another thing, they look forward to internet interactions. If you look forward to internet interactions more than you do personal interactions, we're starting to get into an unhealthy area where you're focusing more on in non-personal relationships, the distance. So develops unrealistic expectations based on what they see posted. So this can be really bad. It can actually lead into eating disorders. If we think about if we were to see like models or athletes on Instagram and you start wanting to be like them, this can set unrealistic expectations. Some of you do not have bodies that are developed enough to even be close to doing what some of these people are doing athletically. Others of you, you're way behind in puberty and this can put pressure on you and make you feel like you're less or you're not as, what's the word? Oh, I can't think of the word. Anyway, if somebody's less developed than you, or if you're less developed than the other person, it makes you feel kind of behind, and this can cause depression. Like I said, this could also cause eating disorders because if somebody is looking at models and they feel like they're fat and they get their idea of what is beauty from Instagram, it's going to set this tone inside their head that they feel the need to look like that and they're willing to go to any lengths. Not everybody looks like that, okay? And we see this a lot when we watch TV shows. Every person is an actor, remember that. When you watch TV shows about high school, all those people are actually 22, 23. Most high schoolers don't look like that. Walk into Bowling Green High School and see how many of the kids actually look like those actors in TV. I'm going to guarantee you it's very, very, very few. Okay? So that unrealistic expectation of that is where you're supposed to be can be very dangerous. It can lead into eating disorders because if you think you're supposed to look like that, you might start taking on bad habits, which is how this ends up developing. Socially withdraw, begin to neglect self-care to engage in online activities. So what happens is when people start focusing too much time on the internet, they're going to start, oh, I forgot to brush my teeth. Oh, it's not a big deal. Did I shower today? I don't know. They start engaging in the internet and they start so much that they stop taking care of themselves. That's when this addiction has hit a point that, we got some serious issues. If you start worrying about the internet more than you worry about your own health and safety, that's when it becomes a problem. There's a lot of activities that I would do to help explain these to you kids, and unfortunately, we're not in school. So if you have any questions or if I left anything that was slightly confusing, let me know. No homework because I have a lot of students that I need to get on Google Classroom and that we need to fix a couple things. So use this day, use tomorrow as a catch-up day. I won't post anything tomorrow, just catch up on what you need, okay? Well, that's it for today. Have a wonderful day.